Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be taking a look at the Durango CPU. Now, before we begin, I just want to do the normal disclaimer that once again, Durango has not been formally announced yet. As such, the specifications are only rumors and leaks. However, there is quite a lot of information. I'd also like to point out I've already done an article on this, and I'd recommend you check out the article because I'm going to mention some stuff in there that I haven't mentioned in the video, simply because of brevity's sake, and also because there's actually images in there and they tie in with everything that I'm saying. So anyway, Durango CPU is very much like the PlayStation 4. In fact, it pretty much is the PlayStation 4 CPU. It will be using the AMD Jaguar, and just like the AMD Jaguar for the PS4, it's going to be focused on highly multi-threaded technology. In other words, it's going to be using 8 cores. Now, as it turns out, the cores are split up very similar to the Jaguar. It turns out there are 2 modules, and those modules can communicate with one another. We'll speak about that in a moment. But those modules, the 2 modules, shall I say, contain 4 x64 cores each. We are fairly certain that they run at 1.6 gigahertz. Although it's possible they may be a bit faster depending on the heat output of the console. Obviously, the Jaguar, we're only talking about the CPU side of things. In reality, it's actually an APU. And so that means that the actual GCN cores or the graphics system will actually be built in, along with some other components as well. Once again, we're not really going to talk about that so much. However, because of all of this, it will increase the heat output of the CPU, so obviously they're going to have to tune the clock speed accordingly. Anyway, each of the cores has 32 KB of instruction cache, and it also has 32 KB of data cache, and those 4 cores in turn will share 2 megabytes of level 2 cache. Now, this is per core, and the level 2 cache is per module, so in fact you get 4 megabytes total. Now, this is very different to the Xbox 360. In fact, there's numerous differences to the Xbox 360, and we'll go into those just how I did with the PS3 versus the PS4. The the Xbox 360 CPU was significantly easier to program for than the Cell. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video, it turns out that the SPUs of the PlayStation 3 Cell were used to actually do quite a lot of the calculations that the Durango's move engines do. Now, I haven't got a video on that, but just to keep people up to date, or just to remind people, the move engines are basically there to throw data around the system with very minimal impact on the rest of the components. In other words, so that, let's assume the CPU and the GPU are working flat out, the data can continue to be thrown around the bus as fast as possible without further stressing those components. In other words, without them required to do more work to actually figure out what data is required. That's just a brief overview. Once again, you can go check out the Move Engine video, and I've got an article of it as well. Anyway, with the Xbox 360 CPU, which of course was PowerPC based, it had 3 cores, and those cores ran significantly faster, although we'll get into that later on. Now, those 3 cores actually handled 2 threads each. As it turns out, the Xbox 720 doesn't do that. Each of its cores handles 1 thread, so that means total you have 8 hardware threads available. Now, the 4 cores communicate with the level 2 cache using a dedicated interface, and then they'll also communicate with other areas of the system, including the RAM, as well as between their own cores and so forth, using the core communication interface and the North Bridge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, both the PS4 and Xbox 720 are going to be using x64 CPUs, and of course that means they do have the x64 instruction set, also known as x86-64, sometimes known as AMD 64 as well. Obviously, if you're used to desktops and so on, you'll be aware of that. Now, 64-bit is required, of course, to address more than 4 gigs of RAM, well, slightly under actually if you want me to be technical, but let's just keep things simple for this anyway. Obviously, most applications now, including most PC ports, are actually 32-bit. I've mentioned this numerous times, but I just want to keep people up to date in case you've missed a couple of the videos previously. Now, as it turns out, this actual architecture is extremely backwards compatible, and some of it actually hasn't changed since the really early Intel CPUs. We're even talking about 16-bit code that goes back in the dawns of time kind of thing. Now, another point is that a lot of the instruction sets that we used to see making arounds, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, such as say MMX and 3D Now, that would be from AMD, have been somewhat phased out, and a requirement, a prerequisite for x64 is actually for SSE2 onwards. Although it's worth noting that the AMD Jaguar CPU does actually go all the way up to SSE 4.2. It also handles a plethora of other different bits and pieces as well, including MOVB, VEX prefixing, and so forth. Once again, I'm not going to bother to read out the entire list. I'll be here for a while, and I just recommend you check out that article, and then you can just Google whatever you'd like. Now let's talk about the performance. You may remember earlier that I was discussing the amount of cores and the amount of threads and the clock speed. Now it's very, very, very tempting for those who are just getting into PCs or technology as a general rule, and to look at the Xbox or the PlayStation CPU speed and to say, well, I see that the Xbox 360 has, 3 CPUs, and they can handle 2 hardware threads each. So let's say 6, and they run at just over 3 gigahertz. And I see that the AMD Jaguars run at 1.6, and has 8 cores. And then they start doing maths. So what they might do, for example, is they may say something like the Xbox 360 CPU runs at just under 20,000 megahertz, and then they'll say that the Durango's runs at like 12,800. And of course, this isn't really how CPUs work in reality. Now, I'm not going to go too heavily into this, because if I was to talk about how CPU architecture evolves over time, in other words, how, say, a CPU A is improved over CPU B. For example, how, say, the Pentium 3 evolved into the Pentium 4, and then, of course, we started to get like the Core 2 quads and so forth. I'd be here for quite a long time, and I would get really off topic. But what I will say is that clock speed is not the marker that is necessarily the most important when it comes to CPUs. How you should basically look at CPU clock speed is within its own family. So for example, let's say you're talking about a Pentium 3 processor, just for example, which is old now, but you get the idea. If it's a 700 MHz Pentium 3, that's a 700 MHz Pentium 3, which will lose to an 800 MHz Pentium 3. Okay, there are some exceptions to the rule. The Pentium 4s, for example, had different bus speeds as well, and cache as well comes into play. But for example, if you were to take a Pentium 4 and you were to take a modern processor such as, let's go with any of the i5 range, and you were to clock them at the same clock speed, let's go with 3 gigahertz since we've been banding the figure about anyway, and then you were to set that application to use a single thread. It doesn't really matter what application. It could be video encoding, it could be SuperPi, it could be anything, it really doesn't matter. And you were to just tell it to run on a single thread, in other words, effectively just a single core. Remember that the Pentium 4 did have some hyperthreading processors. Not all of the P4s were hyperthreading. but it was just basically to take advantage of its architecture because it had a fairly long pipeline. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. As I was saying, even if you were to take it on a per-core basis, the Pentium 4 would get thoroughly spanked by the i5. And indeed, even if you were to start overclocking the Pentium 4, and this was the same even back then, the Pentium 4s would be running at highest clock speed. And this is actually, I'm somewhat going off topic, but this is one of the reasons that AMD started to release like the PR numbers. So for example, you'd have a CPU that would be like, 2600 plus, but it would be clocked at like 1.8 or whatever. I can't really remember the exact speed, but it was around there. And they would call that the PR number, the 2600, and all that would be is just the Intel equivalent or supposed Intel equivalent. So basically the motto here is don't rely on the CPU speed as its only gauge. So what actually do we have? What changes are there in the actual architecture? Well, bear in mind that we're not sure about every single one of them, and once again, this is only a rumored leak list. Now, what we can do, however, is since some of the specifications for the AMD Jaguars have already been leaked. By the way, I know I keep saying this, but I have covered quite a bit of this stuff on previous videos, and I've actually got an article going on to the rough performance versus a desktop. And by a desktop, I mean a high-end desktop. Now, just to quickly go into that, the desktop CPUs are very different to how, or should I say, a desktop PC is very different to how a, let's say, console is created. And so it's very difficult to just say, this is how one works and this is how the other works. So you have to kind of compare them apples to apples. But I just created that just to give you guys an idea anyway. So moving back on, there is a plethora of different changes between the two CPUs. Now, one of them is actually cache. Now, cache, just for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, I'll give you a quick overview. Cache is basically a very small amount of memory that's basically embedded onto the die of the CPU. And there are a couple of levels of cache. The basic premise is that if data is held within this cache, it's quicker to pull from, or quicker to use, shall I say, than data on, say, the main system memory. So obviously, if it's a case of the main system memory is required to be accessed, you will get some slowdown. So the efficiency on the Durango CPU has been improved significantly and has been improved to waste less bandwidth. Now remember, bandwidth is extremely precious even in a very low latency and quick environment such as the CPU die. There is still bandwidth wastage and seepage, if you will. So as I was saying, the actual size of the cache, for the most part, at least for say the level 1, is pretty much the same. However, it uses 64-byte cache lines rather than the Xbox 360's 128. So that just means that it's far easier for the system to use efficiently. Furthermore, in terms of the cache, the level 1 cache per core is actually the same. As I was saying, a level 1 cache is 32 KB, but there is something you must remember. With the cores of the AMD Jaguar, they're only handling 1 thread each. So in other words, that's all there is to it. You can think of each core or each thread, should I say, on each core as Insula. In other words, it doesn't have to share room. This is very contrary to how the Xbox 360 operated. Now, I'm not, saying that they made a poor decision. It was actually a very good decision with the CPU of the Xbox 360. Incidentally, it was a lot easier to use than the PlayStation 3, so the PS3s was very powerful with the SPUs. It was just a bit hard to program for. However, in terms of the cache with the level 1 on the Xbox 360, they were running 2 hyperthreads per core. So in effect, the cache was being shared between them, and therefore you can imagine how much of a squeeze that was. It's worth noting that the Jaguar doesn't actually have any level 3 cache, but fortunately the level 2 cache is a lot better. Now once again, just like the level 1 cache, the Xbox 360 was splitting the amount of cache it had per thread and per core. So that meant you just about got about 170 KB. And this is an arbitrary figure, it's not exact, but give or take. On the other hand, the 512 KB per core, effectively anyway, bear in mind that the 4 cores per module share 2 megabytes. Now that means that in effect that they can split data how they need to, share data and so forth, and it also means that it's a lot easier to utilize the data as required. There are also a number of other benefits as well to the CPU. Now, one of those is what is known as speculative execution. For example, if I was to give you a very, very, very simple math problem, let's say 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 4 is 8, and so forth, and you can get the idea that I'm giving you a very simple math problem, and therefore, if we kept going for a while, your brain would begin to pick up the pattern, and you would say to me, hey, I know what this dude's going to tell me next. However, if I was to suddenly say to you a different figure, like if I was to say 8 times 8, you would have to think about it just for a second longer, because your brain had been predicting it, well, at least theoretically. Now, one of the things that both PlayStation 4's creator Mark Cerny and supposedly anyway the Xbox 360's creators, although obviously they're keeping it a lot more tighter under wraps, and Sony are being very boastful, if you will, about this. Someone's got to use the word brash, but they're certainly being very boisterous over the fact. They've got quite a lot of pride in the way that their CPU operates. Now, obviously there is a number of changes that are very specific to the Sony hardware, and we're not sure about all of them in regards to Microsoft's changes. However, generally speaking, the Xbox 360 CPU would execute orders, or shall I say execute instructions in an order, and this would be based upon how the compiler set them out. In other words, it would just do things how it was told. There was no thought process in there. It was brain dead. It just said, okay, next instruction, next instruction, next instruction. So it's kind of like if I gave you a table and I was to say, follow this instruction exact. Whereas on the other hand, it would make so much more sense if, you were to put the second leg on first, because you would be able to balance it. But I was to say, no, you have to put it on that corner instead, so it becomes twice as difficult. There's just no room for interpretation. In other words, it's just almost an automaton. Now, once again, in a theoretical, perfect, wonderful world with, unicorns and rainbows and sunshine, it's not that bad, because in theory, the compiler should be able to be effective and efficient. But as I was saying in the Mark Cerny video and a couple of others, it's a case of it has to basically live on how effective the compiler is. In other words, if the compiler isn't perfect and can't eliminate any slowdowns or whatever, they are immediately passed along to the CPU. There's just nothing the CPU can do about it apart from hold on and brace for impact. But on the other hand, the Durango CPU can execute instructions what are known as OOO, also known as out of order. What the Durango does is effectively predict what the next piece of data it needs, because it works on almost a string. So in other words, it's following a logical path and says, okay, I see where this is going, and so I'm going to continue to move forward because I figure I know what else I need to pull and what it will be calculated. So it will begin to figure that out. Therefore, in theory, it will be a lot more efficient. However, you'll notice that I said guess. And the problem with guessing is that you can be right 99% of the time, but sometimes you're going to be wrong. Now, I'm not saying the efficiency is 99%, or anything like that, I'm just using a figure. So, what happens if it's wrong? Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. Well, in this case, it will say, okay, oopsie daisy, the result will then be completely ignored, it will be dropped, and then the CPU will then start to look for the data in the correct address location. In other words, either in, let's say, one of the other CPU registers, or the, for example, cache, or system memory, and so forth. What other goodies are there? Well, there is a couple actually, and these are even more effective actually. Now, you might have heard me talk about parallelization quite a bit, and parallelizing instructions is becoming extremely important, especially on modern CPUs. Back in the day, he says, as he puts on the 80s sunshades or something, not that I'm that old, but you get the idea, it was a factor of just pure brute force. In other words, we will just get there by throwing in as much possible computational clock speed and everything else we can, and that's about it. However, I think it didn't take too long before developers of both games and, more to the point, the CPU creators started to realize that there were issues. The problem is when you start going this route that you start to hit what's known as problems. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they are effectively die size, clock speed limits, thermal limits, power requirements, and you can get some very, very basic ideas of this just by using the P4. Now, I know I sometimes use the Pentium 4 a bit too much, but I figure it's a really good one because Intel originally expected the process to be able to go a lot higher in terms of clock speed than what they originally managed. They expected it to be going like 4, 5, 6, 7 gigahertz, but in reality they achieved maybe about, two-thirds of that, about half that, maybe slightly less in some cases. And one of the reasons for this is just quite simply per heat. And so it becomes a case where parallel operations are definitely becoming a lot more important. Now, obviously there are a lot more to this, there is a lot more to this, but I don't really want to get this video off track too much because it's already becoming fairly lengthy. So anyway, most recent x64 processors are very different to how they used to be. And they don't actually execute the x64 instructions natively. Instead, the CPU works on what is known as micro operations. And the instructions will be basically taken, interpreted, decoded into these micro operations, if you will, and then they can be parallelized. Now, the CPU cores have actually dual x64 instruction decoders, so they can actually decode 2 instructions per clock cycle. However, reality isn't quite that good. And obviously, this is kind of perfect world stuff. On average, x86 instructions are converted to 1.7 micro operations. Now, there are a number of other small changes to the CPU, and a couple of larger ones as well, but I don't want to go too much into those last couple because they're kind of scraping the barrel. Plus, as well, because the Durango still hasn't been confirmed, it's still a little bit up in the air now. I have got some articles on the website concerning AMD Jaguar, so you can just go there and search. Speaking of the website, I actually need to move it to a new server in the next couple of days, because I don't like how slow this current server is, don't you know? I will be covering the Durango a lot more extensively actually over the next couple of months Obviously, we have quite a lot of news coming up concerning E3. That's just over a month away, but I think it's going to be a very, very, very interesting time because no doubt there's going to be a lot more analysis after the developers conference, which I've heard is going to be very early in E3. I think it's like the 7th or something like that. 7th or 10th. My brain is not working too well today. So yeah. I think that just about does it for this particular video. Hopefully it's been somewhat useful to you in understanding the architecture. What I'm hoping to do over the next couple of weeks and months is to start going more extensively into the actual processes of how PCs work and so forth. I've been a bit behind where I actually wanted to be initially, if I'm honest. But unfortunately, I've had a few other things that I've been wanting to do, and getting things sort of prepared in the background, so to speak. But rest assured, I am not resting on my laurels. Once again, guys, I do respond to comments occasionally on RGT's comment section, in other words, the actual videos comment section, shall I say. But generally speaking, I'm better to reach on Facebook. So I'd recommend you go to facebook.com/redgamingtech or message directly on YouTube, although Facebook is better. Why, I hear you scream? Well, it's actually nothing nefarious, I'm not like trying to get you to like the page or, anything like that, but it's a very simple reason that I don't have access to YouTube and so on, or the comments at work, and I work obviously full time, and so I can actually respond lunch breaks and whatever else on Facebook on my cell phone. I don't have the YouTube or whatever hooked up to my cell phone. I've got my own personal accounts and stuff on there because of Gmail and you know the drill. So yeah, I generally respond better to Facebook. Once again, not trying to get you to like the page. Obviously, it would be great if you did because of support and all of that jazz, but I'm just merely pointing out the simple fact, unfortunately. I have this horrible thing called a job. Anyway, oh God, it's one of those days today. I accidentally broke a site. Yeah. Well, it turns out that... well, let's just go with DNS records. If you make a typo in them, it takes a while to repropagate. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, that's my admission for the month. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.